Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. You're definitely going to hear the snoring of Storm, I'm afraid, because she's fast asleep and she's snoring ahead of, and even though she's small, she's really loud. She snores like I don't know, it's like a truck. Anyway, urban legends regarding death. Road to Heaven. Sandra Elaine West, the glorious ex-model wife of the late Texan oil magnate, lived the high life in Los Angeles. She was reportedly a keen student of Egyptology, and the ancient Egyptian concept of being buried with one's most prized possessions apparently appealed to her. In 1977, when she was only in her 30s, she was found dead of mysterious causes in a Beverly Hills mansion, and it quickly became clear that she had been determined to continue a luxury lifestyle into the afterlife. Her relatives were surprised, or perhaps not, to learn that she had left instructions that she should be buried with her husband, wearing a lace nightgown and sitting in a favourite Ferrari. She had several, with the seat slanted comfortably. Her brother-in-law, who stood to receive $2 million from the estate if her wish was carried out, nonetheless went to court to avoid the elaborate funeral. After weeks of deliberation, the judge eventually ruled that there was no legal reason why someone should not be buried inside a Ferrari, and that Sandra should finally be laid to rest according to her wishes. When the day came, a body was flown to Texas wearing a nightgown and was placed in a powder blue 1964 Ferrari 250 GT, today worth millions, with the seat comfortably reclined. The car was then loaded inside a container, lowered into a 9-foot deep hole, and covered in concrete to deter grave robbers. The simple gravestone beside her husband provides no hint as to a luxurious resting place below. That's good, because you wouldn't want people to try and dig it up, let's be real. Sweet Kiss of Death. An American jockey was riding the 20-to-1 short horse, Sweet Kiss, in a 2-mile race in New York City when he slumped over in the saddle, somehow managing to stay on board as his horse went on to jump the last fence and cross the line in first place by a head. He didn't celebrate his win, the first of his career, as when the horse's owners went to congratulate him on the race, well, they found him dead. He suffered a heart attack during the race, becoming the first and only corpse to win a horse race in the United States. It was thought that the attack had been brought on by the strict weight loss regime undertaken by the horse trainer. He was not a regular jockey, and the excitement of riding a winner, well, there you go. Geesh, that's a bit awful, isn't it? That's not funny, is the next. It was the week before Halloween, and towns across America were being decorated with pumpkins, witches' hats, and spiders' webs, ready for the parties to come. Some householders went further than others, hanging skeletons from windows and even hoisting dummies, mocked up as corpses on trees and garages, or protruding from car boots. Some locals complained that such decorations were tasteless and brought the neighbourhood down, while some were even scared enough to call the police. A few days before Halloween, a frightening figure appeared overnight, hanging from a tree near a busy road. But most of the people who drove past weren't that shocked, and nobody made any calls to 911. Not for a couple of days, at least. Then somebody walking past the decoration thought that it looked a little too realistic up close, and upon closer inspection, discovered why. It was the real dead body of a woman who had hanged herself. Similarly, in another town, a man had shot himself in the head on his balcony and lay undisturbed for several days after his neighbours mistook his lifeless body for an elaborate Halloween decoration. More recently, people in an Ohio neighbourhood were shocked when construction workers realised that a dummy hanging on a fence was not, as they assumed, a stupid Halloween prank, but the body of a murdered woman. So next time you see a gruesome Halloween setup, you might want to check whether it's real. Or maybe you don't. Those are not urban legends. Those really happened. The next one is Wake Up Call. Early morning phone calls can be such a pain. One Saturday in 1992, a middle-aged North Carolina man was woken early by the sound of his telephone ringing on his bedside table. Still half asleep, he reached for the phone but grabbed instead the Smith & Wesson handgun 38. Oh boy, he had left on the table the night before. Much to the horror of his wife, who was watching from the other side of the bed, he put the revolver to his head as if answering a call, and the gun discharged, killing him instantly. That's horrible. If that's real, that's awful. That's really awful. Whew. The electric chair. A convicted murderer spent several years in solitary on death row, bound for the electric chair, until the last moment his lawyers managed to get his sentence commuted to life. Some years afterward, he claimed to have turned his life around and to have dedicated himself to his studies. He was still kept in solitary, where inmates were allowed a small TV set to keep them company, provided they used headphones. One night, the reformed man was sitting naked on the metal toilet in his cell, trying to fix the earphones that enabled him to hear the television, when he accidentally bit into a live wire and dropped down dead from the electrocution. He'd been killed by an electrical chair of his own making. Perhaps a little more studying had been required. The next is Wakey Wakey. An electronics student from China had reluctantly travelled to the United States to continue his education. He was there at the behest of his family, who had sacrificed much to send him and expected him to be a success. There was one major stumbling block, though. He always had trouble getting up on time. He had tried everything, from drugs to hypnosis and alarm clocks, but he was still missing lectures, and back home his family were wondering why his grades were not up to scratch. One day he saw an advert for an alarm clock that gave small electrical shocks to wake people up, and, as he was desperate for something that could get him out of bed in the morning, he decided to look into it. He couldn't afford the item in the advert, so he decided to use his skills to build it himself. Also proving to himself and his family in this process that he wasn't useless, he began by borrowing some lecture notes from his classmate, who never missed a lesson, on how to construct the required circuits. He then collected a car battery, clock and wires, and worked through the night to put the contraption together, adding the final touches by attaching himself to the device and setting the alarm to wake him in plenty of time for his early morning lecture. Satisfied with his work, he slept easy. He never woke up. Later that morning, his classmate came to his room to retrieve her borrowed lecture notes. She assumed that he was asleep, as usual, but then she noticed the contraption and the burn marks around his head. She found no pulse, and horrified, she saw her notes still out on the desk. The college investigation found that the sleepy student had miscalculated terribly, and the car battery had shocked his heart with a lethal current, killing him instantly. Do not mess with electricity if you don't know what you're doing, guys. Bad idea. Very, very bad. Don't ever try that at home. Ever. It's bad. The next is Mummy Dearest, and you may have heard of this one. It is a very well-known urban legend, in England anyway. A terminally ill taxi driver from England found fame beyond the grave after responding to a newspaper advert looking for volunteers to be mummified in the style of ancient Egyptians. The researchers wanted to see how effective the process really was, and he thought it would give his grandchildren something special to remember him by. When the man's time came, his body was handled according to the 3,000-year-old technique used to preserve the corpse of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. His organs were removed, leaving only the brain and the heart, and sealed in jars. Then his insides were cleaned out with alcohol, packed with bags of spices and sawdust, and stitched back up again. His body was soaked in salt water for several months, and his skin treated with oil and wax. Finally, his corpse was wrapped in linen sheets and left to dry for 3 months. The experiment was judged to be 100% successful, yielding results regarded as extremely authentic. The modern mummy was then taken to its final resting place at a medical museum in London, where it can be studied by archaeologists used to examining rather old specimens. The next is fan death. Some people believe that if you leave an electric fan running in the room where you sleep, you will never wake up. Well, those stories first originated in Asia, particularly in South Korea, where it was said that the technology could suck the life out of unsuspecting people as they slept. Explanations range from asphyxiation, caused by the fan displacing oxygen from the room, to hypothermia, as the contraption drives heat away from the body. Some say that the rumour was started by a government official in a bid to reduce electricity consumption. Fans sold in parts of Asia now have timers to ensure that they turn themselves off after a set period of time. But whatever the truth, South Koreans still remember to turn them off before falling to sleep, just to make sure. The next is the dead phone line. A high school student called Dave, who was planning to attend a top military academy, had been found dead in his room. He was in peak condition, as attested by the physical exam that he'd recently passed, with flying colours. Relatives found him in his bedroom, a telephone still next to his ear, as if he had died before he could end a conversation. He had only been alone in the room for a few minutes, and the person who had been on the other end of the phone line described hearing only a click and then a short gasp. It was months before investigators found the cause of death. A post-mortem revealed no external injuries, but forensic scientists discovered that he had died of bleeding in the inner ear, thus indicating some kind of electrical surge that had shocked the brain by the auditory nerve. Experts suspected that the phone held the clue. There had been a powerful thunderstorm on the night when Dave died, and they had thought that lightning could have struck the phone cables and passed a fatal shock through the receiver. But there was no physical evidence in the boy's room to suggest that this had happened, not even any burns on the phone line. In the end, it was concluded that the only possibility was that the phone had killed him. Investigators working on the case discovered that a lightning strike can give you a fatal electric shock through a phone line without leaving any evidence of burns or damage on the phone line itself. The electricity passes straight into your inner ear and from there to your brain, without the usual resistance provided by the body. Therefore, it's probably best to avoid using your phone during a thunderstorm. I will absolutely remember that now. That's scary. Yeesh. The next is I Believe I Can Fly. At least that's Rose Gold. Way out in the Arizona desert, a police patrol looking for a missing man from a nearby town came upon what looked like a car wreck. But this was no normal accident. The vehicle was stuck impossibly high up the side of a cliff, at least 100 feet above the road below. It took weeks for the accident investigators to sift through the evidence and work out what had happened. After inspecting every bit of the wreckage, they eventually found fragments of a driving license and realised that they had found their missing man. The ex-Air Force engineer, who had always wanted to be a pilot, had got hold of a miniature jet engine from the base where he used to work, and he attached it to the back of his family saloon car. His goal was to take it to the Utah Salt Flats and break a land speed record. First of all, though, he needed to test the system, so he headed out into the desert to see what speed he could get up to. As dawn broke, he pointed the car down an empty straight road, estimating he had about 5 miles of straight tarmac before he needed to brake. He started the car rolling with a conventional engine, reaching the speed limit, and then ignited the jet. At first, there was no difference, but then he heard the turbine winding up, and he was shoved back in his seat by the acceleration, unable to lean forward and turn off the ignition. He covered those 5 miles in no time at all, and then the flat road gave way to a canyon. The car destroyed the traffic barrier and flew right over the ravine, crashing into the other side. At the man's funeral, his friends remarked grimly that at least he had died following his dream. The next is your worst nightmare. A middle-aged woman from Kazan, Russia, was rushed to a local hospital by her husband after collapsing at home. She had suffered a suspected heart attack and was declared dead on arrival. The funeral was arranged for a couple of days later, and the coffin was put on display. The relatives had arrived and the ceremony had begun when they heard a knocking sound coming from somewhere in the funeral parlour. They all looked at each other, and when the screaming started, they soon realised where it was coming from, inside the coffin. The woman was not dead. She had awoken in the middle of her own funeral. Any relief her relatives might have felt after the terrible shock had worn off soon reverted to sadness, as the supposedly deceased was so traumatised by the experience of hearing her loved ones praying for her that she suffered a second heart attack at the scene, which really did kill her. At least her incompetent doctors hoped it had. Wow. Yeah. There's a lot of stories back in the day, I understand that, when medical things weren't as advanced, they would bury people and they would put bells above the ground and the string would lead down into their coffins or ground where they were buried, so they could ring the bell if they were actually still alive, because that would happen. They would bury you alive, and you'd need a way to communicate that, hey, I ain't dead. But believe it or not, there are stories of things like that happening today. Absolutely. One of my uncles had a very serious health issue. I'm not going to what the health issue was or whatever, but he was pronounced dead. Like dead. They were taking him to the morgue. He had a tag on and everything. He was going to the morgue, and he sat up. He was alive. Did he die for, I don't know. Was it just that his body was in some sort of comatose state? No idea. But that wasn't very long ago. We're talking 1980s. And considering how advanced we are, I don't know, it's a bit weird. Like I said, there's lots of stories like that, but it did happen to my uncle. He was pronounced dead. He sat up on his way to the morgue, scaring absolute living shit out of the person who were pushing him down there. And the first thing he said is, I saw the gates. It's not my time. And that's all he said, and hey ho, here he is. He's still there today, still about today. So, there's stories like that out there. The next is called The Crater. In the Godzilla stories, Mount Mahara, a volcano on the Japanese island of Izuwashima, is where the government imprisoned the famous monster. In real life, it is an equally frightening place. The volcano is active, and from a rocky outcrop you can see the boiling crater and clouds of sulphur. In the 1920s, an unhappy schoolgirl hiked up to the viewing spot and committed suicide by jumping into the crater. A few weeks later, another girl heard about the incident and followed suit. The suicides were all over the news, and before long it became a popular place for people to take their own lives in a spectacular fashion. The idea of instant cremation catching people's imagination. Hundreds of macabre sightseers flocked to the island, many of them booking one-way tickets, and it was not unusual for at least one person every day to throw themselves into the lava. The volcano continued to take lives until the 1930s, when more than 600 people committed suicide in 1 year alone. The pull of the island proved so strong that the government stepped in and barred entry to the jumping spot, stopping the sale of one-way tickets and leaving the volcano alone to wait for its next eruption. That's really sad. The next is Screamathon. It was once the tradition at California University to organise screamathons in the dormitories. Everybody in on the joke, sometimes hundreds of students, would holler at the top of their voices at a designated time, usually midnight, or the early hours for no apparent reason, other than to blow off steam in exam season or terrorise unsuspecting classmates and supervisors. The practice happened once or twice a term and had been going on for years. One night, when another screamathon was due to take place, the dormitory suddenly erupted into a cacophony of screaming and howling for 30 seconds, right on schedule at 1 a.m, before everything went quiet again. The next morning, a girl was found dead in her room. Investigators estimated the time of death to be between midnight and 2 a.m, but fellow students knew exactly when she had died. She'd been strangled at exactly 1 a.m, when nobody could hear a scream. That was the last screamathon at the university. The perpetrator was never found, so nobody knew whether it was a student who was in on the joke or an intruder who had slipped in and out without nobody noticing. That's sad. The Stag Party from Hell was next. A newly engaged man from Minnesota had big plans for a stag party. He and his friends were going to hire a motorhome and drive more than 800 miles across 4 states to Kentucky, Derby and Louisville. They picked out their party ride and went on the road. Only after a couple of hours, his mates started to complain about an unpleasant odour in the vehicle. They thought it might be coming from outside, but closing the windows didn't help, so they turned off the air conditioning to see if that was a culprit, but it made no difference. They had to stop off for supplies, so they took the opportunity to search the vehicle from top to bottom, looking for the source of the terrible stench. They soon found it. One of the men opened a luggage compartment in the body of the motorhome and was almost passed out. There was a corpse stuffed inside, and it wasn't fresh. Immediately, the men's thoughts turned to the person from whom they had rented the van, who had told them specifically that the front luggage holds were not working and were not to be opened. The stag party were held up for several hours as police questioned them. They actually never made it to the horse race they were going to. What a Way to Go is the next. A group of forestry workers were trudging through the blackened remains of a 1,000-acre California forest that had been destroyed by a recent fire. As they assessed the damage, stepping over the still smouldering, barren landscape and avoiding the bodies of the small mammals that hadn't managed to escape the smoke, they came upon something both shocking and utterly puzzling. The charred remains of a man, unmistakably dressed as a diver, complete with melted flippers, wetsuit, and oxygen tank, which was still intact, despite the fire. When the authorities tried to identify the unfortunate man, they unravelled an unbelievable tragedy. First of all, the post-mortem revealed that the diver did not die from burns or smoke inhalation, but from head and internal injuries. Then the mystery deepened, as it transpired that on the day the fire took hold, he had been diving in a regular spot near a wreck off the coast, some 30 miles away from where he had been found. Soon the authorities consulted with the fire service and were told that firefighting planes or water bombers had been sent over the same stretch of water on that day. These vehicles skim the surface of the sea and collect thousands of gallons of water in huge buckets, slung from the fuselage. The police realised with horror what had happened. Somehow one of the water bombers had, sucked the diver up into its water bucket and then dumped him in the forest fire. As he was wearing his oxygen tank, it's possible that he was still alive until he actually hit the ground. I have no words for that. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. Whew. The next is an extra member of staff. Staff at London law firm had been bothered by flies in their office for days. They opened windows to let the insects out, but they seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the building. Then they started to notice a strange smell, even though the office was clean from top to bottom every morning. They thought that an animal might have crawled in somewhere and died, so they hired pest controllers to search for a possible rat or unfortunate stray cat. By that point, the smell was so bad that the entire floor had to be left unused. The pest controllers spotted the fireplace. It hadn't been used since the building was converted into an office many years previously, and the chimney had been blocked up to stop drafts. Maybe something had crawled into the empty space. They started to knock bricks out of the wall, and when flies burst out of the hole, they were overpowered by a terrible smell. They knew they had found the source of the problem. They were horrified to discover that there was a dead body jammed in the chimney, in the early stages of decomposition. How he had got there was a mystery, but the coroner concluded that it had been in that space for several weeks. The police had been called to the building weeks earlier to check out what they thought was a failed break-in attempt after builders reported a hole in the roof, which they suspected had been made by thieves looking to steal valuable lead cladding. It turned out that the break-in had been more successful than they'd realised, and the intruder had actually never left the building. It was not known how he came to be inside the chimney, but at some point he'd fallen and become stuck upside down in a narrow opening. He had probably suffocated before he starved. Jeez. The Santa Trap. A man in California lit the fire in his hearth for the first time that winter one evening. He noticed that something was wrong when he saw smoke filling the room and assumed that something was blocking the chimney, even though it had been swept only weeks earlier. Then he heard a scrabbling noise coming from the wall and desperate cries for help. To his horror, he realised that someone was stuck up there. He frantically tried to put the fire out, eventually swamping it with a bucket of water and causing smoke to billow up while the person was still frantically trying to escape. When firefighters arrived, they tried to pull the intruder out from below, but he was too high up, so they smashed through the bricks underneath him and pulled him out. However, they were too late. He died from smoke inhalation. Police suspected that he was a burglar, and he'd been attempting to enter the property during the night when he thought the owner would be asleep. Nice. The next is La Pascualita. In 1930, the owner of a shop selling bridal dresses in Chihuahua, Mexico, suffered a terrible tragedy. Her daughter was at the wedding shop on the day she was due to get married, preparing to don the intricate and beautiful dress that her mother had made for her. It was brought out of the back room and laid out carefully for the bride. She put it on, but as it was being fastened, she let out a cry of pain. Holding her back and slumped to the floor. She never regained consciousness. An employee claimed to have seen a black widow jump from the dress after the incident, and the doctor said that the girl had indeed suffered a fatal spider bite that poisoned her blood. This is only the beginning of her story, however. Her mother was distraught and could not bear to part with her daughter, so, in secret, she hatched a plan to keep her close forever. According to legend, she enlisted a local funeral parlour to deploy their skills in embalming the girl so that she looked almost alive, and then, instead of taking the body to church, she installed it in her wedding shop storeroom, where she could look at her all day. Exactly 1 year after her death, which would have been the girl's first wedding anniversary, locals were greeted by a new mannequin in the dress shop. It was wearing the very same dress that the owner's daughter had been wearing when she was killed. When people who had known the girl commented on how the doll looked just like her, the owner claimed that the resemblance to her daughter was just a sad coincidence, but that she couldn't bear to get rid of that dress. The mannequin started to attract visitors who were drawn by her beautiful lifelike features, and so people began to go to the shop just to gaze in wonder at La Pascualita, as she became known. Rumours began circulating that the dummy did not just look like the dead girl. It was the dead girl. It was said that her eyes followed visitors around the shop as they browsed, that she would change her poses when no one was looking, and that she appeared in different places each morning, as if she had been moving around when the shop was closed. One story described how a magician had fallen in love with La Pascualita and would take her out dancing at night. The owner continued to deny it. Who would do such a thing? But people who worked in the store were in no doubt at all that La Pascualita was more than a lifeless mannequin. When they got up close to change her dress, they would break out in a cold sweat, disturbed by her long, delicate eyelashes, slightly wrinkled hands, green eyes that appeared to be wet with tears, and even varicose veins on her legs. Even sceptical observers, determined to prove to others that the figure was only a mannequin, were said to be so captivated by her beauty that they left the shop convinced that she was real. After the owner died, the legend of La Pascualita continued to live on, and today people still travel from miles around to marvel at her beauty and the green eyes that follow you around the room. I wonder if it is. Would she do that though, or would she want her daughter to be laid to rest, you know? Maybe she had a mannequin made of her liking, like exactly of her liking. You can do that. They can put like even beauty marks and like scars on it and everything to make it look extremely real. So it's possible. Next is Quiet in the Library. Jackie was a student at Penn State University. One evening she told her friends that she was going to the library to revise for an exam she was due to sit. The place was busy, as it was getting close to the end of term, and everybody had deadlines to meet. Jackie was a popular girl on campus and had several witnesses and reporters seeing her in the library. That night, remarked that she was her usual friendly self. Most of the students were keeping quiet, as required by the rules of the place, and had their heads stuck in their books, so nobody heard anything or saw anything unusual. Then a man leaving the library told the desk staff that there was somebody needing medical help on the first floor. They found Jackie lying behind a bookshelf, struggling to breathe. An ambulance was called, but she died upon arrival at hospital. She'd been stabbed with an arrow instrument through the heart. Her red dress had concealed the bloodstains. She was attacked only a few feet from a study group, whose members claimed not to have heard or seen anything. The man who alerted the staff was never identified. Even after thousands of police interviews, the murderer has never been found. The next is underpants. Yes, underpants are dangerous. Next time you try to pull a wedgie on one of your friends and yank their underpants out of their trousers, beware that people have died in similar stunts. An American man fought with his stepfather and gave him what he called an atomic wedgie when you pull the victim's underpants up over their head, causing the older man's death when the elastic from his pants became stuck around his neck and eventually suffocated him. The prankster was sent to jail for 30 years after being convicted of manslaughter. The next is funeral fright. A Brazilian mother was mourning the untimely death of her son, a window cleaner in his 30s, who prior to his death had not been seen for months. At a ceremony at her home in a town near Sao Paulo, when a surprise visitor made an entrance. Everybody present saw that he bore a striking resemblance to the man in the coffin, which caused some to faint and others to flee in horror. Were they seeing a ghost? The previous day, the man's brother had read that a window cleaner had been killed in the area and, fearing it could be his brother, visited the mortuary to find out for sure. He sadly identified the dead man as his missing sibling, and the rest of the family, who probably had other things on their mind, did not notice anything out of place. After all, who knows what death might do to someone's appearance? On the day of the ceremony, the window cleaner, alive and well, and back in town, bumped into a friend in the street, who told him in disbelief that he was about to miss his own funeral. He telephoned another acquaintance, who happened to be at the ceremony, but the call was dismissed as a cruel hoax. Back from the dead, the man decided to put things to rest, so to speak. Turned up at his mother's house in person, becoming the guest of honour at his own funeral. The identity of the poor man in the coffin, well, that was never determined. And those are the urban legends that come under death. And quite gruesome, some of them, and quite grisly tales, might I add. And some of them are almost hard to believe, really. Like the wedgie one, for example. And the alarm clock one, I mean, who would put a gun in the same spot as their alarm clock? When you wake up in the morning, you kind of imagine Lee does that. Lee has a gun outside of his alarm clock, actually, so yeah, I'm gonna... You know what, I better tell him not to do that, actually. That would... You know what? Yeah. Thanks for listening. Many blessings.